and to introduce Tony's message, and is going to actually play the reading read by David Suchet. Thank you, Ben.
Acts, chapter 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Andromitium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us aboard. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind didn't allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbour in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So, keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.' On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 40 meters deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found it was 30 meters deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless those men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Acts chapter 28. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was ill in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of those on the island who were ill came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. After 3 months we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship, with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. The next day the south wind came up, and on the following day we reached Puteoli. There we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them, and so we came to Rome.
I'm reading through some of the Psalms recently, and in quite a lot of them there are expressions of the writer, whoever it may be, expressing all kinds of concerns and situations that they found in their lives or in their surroundings that just didn't make sense. And often there was a sense of frustration, even blaming God, and feeling of hopelessness. And Psalm 77 says this: "Will the Lord reject us forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? He's struggling to understand what's going on. And then the following verses say, Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years at the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles long ago. I will meditate on your works and consider your mighty deeds. I don't know if you like adventure stories. I'm sorry the reading was quite a long one. I didn't know quite where to break it off. And I thank Anne for all the perseverance in putting it together. Last time I spoke, I started giving my testimony, and I just wanted to carry on a little bit this morning. The reading we had was some of Paul's adventures, and there are others scattered throughout the New Testament, and in fact there are lots of adventures of different people in the Old Testament as well. And in some ways I just want to kind of follow through that theme. I've never been on such experiences as Paul, but I have had quite a few unexpected and unusual situations that I had to face, and with the Lord's help I've been able to face them. So just a brief summary of where we got to. The last time I took the service, I started my life story. I was brought up in Buckinghamshire, the second eldest of a family of 14 children. I accepted Jesus as my Saviour when I was around 20, and I worked for 7 years in an office of an an engineering firm. I felt called to full-time service. I did a 2-year Bible training course at a missionary training college in Birkenhead. I applied to the mission called WEC and did a training course with them, and then spent a further almost 2 years preparing for going to Uruguay in South America. I finished last time at the point of sailing from Southampton on May 28th, 1970. So we'll take up from there. I only received my visa 10 days before my sailing date, which was a bit close to the mark when you have lots of things depending on it. When I boarded the ship, I only knew one other person, and she was a WEC worker returning for her second term of service in a part of Brazil. However, within a very short time of being on the ship, we found out that there were at least 7 missionaries on board. There were Jill and 2 other couples returning to different parts of Brazil, another lady returning to Argentina, and myself being the odd one out, the rookie, the first timer. And I must say, I enjoyed the fellowship, and it was a great experience to have time to spend with more mature ones who have been serving the Lord in different climates and learn from them. The ship, the SS Pasteur, carried cargo as well as passengers. Our first stop was in Le Havre, then Vigo, followed by Lisbon. One incident that stays with me was that when we were on the dock alongside in Vigo, because it was unloading cargo in most places, we were able to get off the ship and spend time until they told us we needed to be back on board, ready to sail. And there was the Voice of Vigo's radio station playing out along the shore, and it was a song that the British entry from the Eurovision Song Contest, All Kinds of Everything Remind Me of You. And there was me just having left home without any idea of when I would next be home. I can't say very much in Vigo reminded me of home, but it was quite sentimental and quite heart-wrenching in a sense, thinking back home and not knowing when I would be back there. From Lisbon, we headed out from the longest part of the journey, which was 9 days without stopping across the Atlantic towards South America. We landed in Rio de Janeiro, and then next stop down was in Santos, further down the coast of Brazil. We arrived in Montevideo on June the 15th, 1970. I must say that on board, because there were some of us, there was a room allocated, and we took services on the Sundays that we were at sea. And on the last Sunday, which was just before we arrived in Montevideo, I had the privilege of taking a service on board the ship before we arrived in the coast of Uruguay. I didn't know anybody when I arrived in Uruguay. I had correspondence with them, and I had met a family who were home on their leave from Uruguay, but I didn't actually know anybody when I arrived in the country. I was met by one of the WEC missionaries from the interior, and he came to the ship to meet me. In those first few days, I soon had an insult into a different culture and different environment. Over the previous years, there had been quite a lot of upset and turmoil in the country of Uruguay. There was social unrest, political unrest, and there were groups of terrorists called Tupamaros. There had been quite a rough time. And the problems were still ongoing. I got to Montevideo, and there had been strikes on. There was a dockers' strike, so they couldn't unload any luggage from the ship. So we had to wait. The ship was going on to Argentina, and a week later, when it came back to Montevideo, they were able to unload luggage and the cargo that was destined for Uruguay. Within a short time, on the dry land, we came across piles of rubbish everywhere and all kinds of stuff. I remember one time we were on a bus, because of the delay in getting back the luggage off the ship, we had to stay in Montevideo, the capital, for a longer time than planned. And we were going around on a bus one day, and it suddenly stopped on the side of the road. We thought, what's this all about? Oh, it's a strike. They stop for 20 minutes, and then they'll go on again. And that was kind of the thing that was happening. And you could see the disruption and the chaos around the country. Just a little bit of background. I'm not going to give too much detail of the actual country and ministry, but I wanted to concentrate on the journeys that I've taken, really. Uruguay is the smallest of the South American countries. In area, it's slightly larger than England, but not quite as big as if you put the whole of the United Kingdom together. Its population, however, has very rarely, if ever, exceeded 3.5 million. It oscillates at around 3.5 million. And of those, about a third, over 1 million, live in or around the capital, Montevideo. So the interior is quite thinly populated. It's the only country without any indigenous people. There are no native people. Everybody is immigrant or descendant of immigrants, mostly Europeans. So you could go around the capital city and you can hear Spanish, Portuguese, German, Italian, Swedish, Russian, British, and other languages being spoken. It's a country that is traditionally Roman Catholic, but there's no recognized state church. There's freedom of religion, but the state does not particularly endorse any church. The British actually have had quite a big influence in Uruguay. The railways were built by British people. The docks were built by a British company. I could remember one time in a building in the interior, and the drain pipes said made in Wolverhampton and that kind of thing. It was quite a lot of British influence, and the country mainly depended on cattle, was its main income. And there were British breeds, the Herefords, the Aberdeen Angus, among many other breeds. So after a week in Montevideo, Alex and myself traveled up to the town of Melo. Uruguay is divided into 19 what they call departments or states, and WEC has always concentrated on the one called Cerro Largo, which is on the Brazilian border. So we traveled up on an overnight bus about 250 miles up country. Now, I used to kind of joke that people would say about the roads, well, the M1, the A1, it was the only one. So you took it a little bit in some cases. There were some roads were pretty good, some were pretty awful. When I got to Melo, I was met by Alex's wife and their 3 sons, and of course I took time to settle in. As I say, I'm not going to go into too much detail of the actual life and stuff there because I wanted to concentrate on something different. My priority was, of course, to get acclimatized and learn, or at least become more fluent in Spanish. I had already learned quite a bit. I'd had lessons beforehand and studied myself. I had teachers who taught me, but I must admit, I think I learned as much by just mixing in the everyday life of the people, especially with the children, because I found that the children, if you said something wrong, they might understand it, but they would tell you if it wasn't right. The adults, if they understood it, would just let it go. The children were much more specific and say, you don't say it like that, or you don't, that's not right. They would correct me, which I appreciated that. The first few months in the interior in Mello, I lived in the Murray's house because they were on furlough in UK. And after I got acclimatized, of course, I accompanied the different ones on their expeditions, on their visits. The Murrays, when they were in England, I had met them briefly, and they came back to Uruguay in 1971, just 6 months or so after I had got there. The WEC ministry had started some years before. It was concentrated in this one area on the Brazilian border, and it was based in Mello, which is a town of about 50,000 people. There are other groups there working. There was a Baptist church. There were several different varieties of Pentecostal churches, and the WEC work, which was more or less an independent evangelical church. There were, from that main point to where we lived, or at least where I lived, the second largest group of believers was in the town of Rio Branco, which is up on the Brazilian border, literally on one side of the road you're in Uruguay, the other side of the road you're in Brazil. So that was the second biggest town that they had to work in, and they also had their own church building. One of the families had lived in Rio Branco beforehand, but they then moved to Mello. There were several other outlying areas that we used to visit regularly down the railway line, such as it was. Unfortunately, when the British pulled out, the Uruguayans made a mess of the railways and it disintegrated. They sometimes ran, sometimes didn't run. They would run and break down. It was very, very unreliable. And after a while, they ceased to exist. In fact, I was just reading a book the other day, and a guy who was into railways, and he had visited Uruguay and was very, very sad to see the state that the Uruguayans had run the railways down from a very good start under the British. Anyway, we used to visit some areas way out into the interior, as well as these slightly smaller towns. Once I got familiar with the environment and got more fluent in Spanish, I would go out with these people, the workers on these visits. One of the interesting things, and one of the things about travel, one of the towns, or rather, we traveled down on the railway or on the bus to a railway town down the line, and from there we used to get the bus, an old rickety old bus on dirt roads for a couple of hour journey out to visit some of the remote areas. And then I say remote, they were just a handful of mud huts, maybe a dozen, 20 mostly related families living in the area, no electricity, no running water. We would visit them. Somebody would visit most months, actually. They'd come to faith, I believe, through radio programs. There were 2 radio stations in Mello, and most of the churches had radio programs which reached out far beyond the town and into the country areas. And I believe these groups of believers had first heard the gospel through the radio programs. And at that time, there were visits once a month. We would normally travel, I think it was on a Wednesday, and stay over till the Monday. I could tell some interesting stories about visits and traveling to those areas, but that will wait for another time. Sufficient to say it was not a kind of lifestyle that everybody would adapt to. You would wake up in the morning, you would have 1 bowl of cold water by the bedside. That was for washing in, cleaning your teeth, shaving in, and that was it for the day. I say there was no running water, no electricity. It was very, very primitive, mud huts, and yet the believers would gather together to worship the Lord and learn of Him. After about 8 months, I was sufficiently competent in Spanish to start traveling on my own. At the end of 1971, that was just over a year or so after I had arrived, the Donnellys, who were the missionaries there, felt that they should return to the UK. The wife was poorly in health and the children were at an age where they really needed to make a decision about secondary education. So the Donnellys left Uruguay in August 1971. The Murrays, when they were there, they were obviously more involved in the work than I was at that time. And the Mellow Church, one of the main points when I applied to go there was that they had a building project. They had a plot of land and we were about to build their own church. They were meeting at the time in a converted house. Now, I've been brought up rather. My dad worked for a building company, but I'd never really been involved in building. But that was one of my commitments to help with the building of a physical church. So right from the very outset when they started the work in March 1971, I think it was, we started progress and clearing the site, digging foundations, and literally there was no phone up a builder's yard and say, can you deliver a lorry load of sand or a skip load of whatever. Everything had to come in by lorry. Two of the members of the church actually had small lorries, and sometimes they would be able to go and collect bags of cement or lorry loads of sand. We had no cement mixers. Everything was by hand. And they didn't just go along and buy the girders to put up. You literally dug the foundations and reinforced them and filled them in ourselves. It was quite tiring and pretty hard work, but it was all done voluntarily. There was one guy who was in charge who was by trade a builder, so he oversaw the work. The building itself, when I came in this morning, I thought, well, it's similar to this building. It was about this size and probably a bit longer, in fact. But it took a long time. We started in March 1971, and they were still not completed when I left in 1976. But it was ongoing work, and as soon as it was inhabitable, as it were, they started having the services in the church, even though it was only a shell. So I was involved in foundations, building walls, fitting window frames, painting doors, putting up ceilings, all kinds of things, which I had never done before, but with the Lord's help, we did it. On the spiritual side, after the Donnellys left, the Murrays felt that they would need to return. Normally, an overseas worker with WEC, at least, the first term of service would be around 3 years. If they were on the continent, obviously, they could probably come home more often than that, but it was South America, a long way away. The understanding was that it would normally be 4 years before it returned home. So because the Murrays had come back soon after I had arrived, their term and their children's education was going to coincide with about the same time as my leave was due. So whatever the exact circumstances were, we consulted with the sending base, and the Murray family actually left Uruguay in September 1975. As a family, I was the last British worker left there, working with the National Uruguayan Folk. A young lady did come out for a couple of years, but really didn't settle, so she only stayed, I think it was probably less than 2 years. So most of the time from that point on, I was the only expatriate missionary there. But because the way things had worked out, quite a lot of the local young lads, fellows, they were willing and able to take part in the services. Some of them would travel to take the services in the outlying areas, and so the ministry carried on. In the meantime, just a few of the things I took part in, obviously my diaries show that I was traveling quite a lot, all over the place. I remember I took, according to my diaries, about 3 funerals, 1 baptism in a river just outside the town, 2 or 3 baby dedications, and actually I conducted 1 wedding before the church was completed, but a young couple wanted to get married, so I conducted the wedding in the shell of a church there in Mellow. So it was a variety of things that I was involved in. And I might add that Bible college really didn't prepare me for very much of that at all. If you're thrown in the deep end and suddenly you've taken a funeral service of somebody you don't know and you think, how do you go on? But the Lord undertook. So, without going into detail, because of this situation, I stayed on longer than I would have done. We couldn't just abandon the work, as it were, although there were workers capable of taking meetings. They weren't really established enough to keep the whole of the ministry going. So through consultation, there was a family in Bogota, in Colombia, who were offered to come down to take up the ministry in Uruguay. So this family came down in October 1976 to take over the ministry in Uruguay. It was quite a turning point, really, because instead of workers from the UK or from America or wherever they might have been being supported by their home country, this was the first time that Colombia had sent missionaries and supported them in a foreign country. So that was quite an event. Very quickly, moving on, I decided that once the Vega family were adjusted to the life and ministry, then I was free to make arrangements to travel home. Peter had come back to Uruguay to sort out their things, so he arrived back in the Melo and was still there when I was preparing to leave. It was quite an undertaking to plan a trip home. I had to book through an agency, and there was no ships coming directly to UK, so I opted to take a ship to Italy. Paul was on his way to Rome. I didn't get as far as Rome. I took a ship that was heading for Naples in Italy. I left Montevideo on this ship called the SS Cristoforo Colombo in November 1976. Now, because I understood Spanish, I opted to sail as far as Barcelona rather than go on to Naples, because at least I could make myself understood in Barcelona rather than trying to understand Italian. The whole thing turned out to be a bit more of an adventure than I had first anticipated. First of all, the ship was a day late leaving Montevideo because of unknown reasons, or they'd had their reasons. I had arranged to stay in Barcelona for one night. My intention was, I should say, I was bringing home with me. I had 5 cases of my own, and one of them was full of books, which was very heavy, and I was bringing a trunk of belongings from the Murray family with me. That was fine on board the ship, but when I got off and tried to get on a train in Barcelona, they don't take trunks on the board a passenger train in Barcelona. Fortunately, I'd been in contact with a family I'd known in Uruguay. They met me at the boat, and they were involved with transport and haulage and things like that. So they very kindly arranged to take the trunk and get it shipped at a later date by freight train to arrive in England at a later stage. But I had to maneuver and manipulate all kinds of things to get that sorted. So I had to stay 2 nights in Barcelona. And from there, I got a train up to crossing over into France. My plan was to get to Boulogne and then across from there. Now, one of the problems was that in those days, there was no quick texts and emails and pick up the phone. My parents didn't have a phone. I had communicated with them when I was planning to leave Montevideo. I had communicated with them from, I think, on the route somehow or other in Barcelona. I must have been able to get over the phone. I had to phone a neighbor to pass on a message to them to tell them the changes of plans. I was already a day late leaving Montevideo. I spent 2 nights in Barcelona rather than 1 night. I had to spend a night in Paris because of difficulties there. On the way up, incidentally, from Barcelona up to Paris, we had to change trains on the border. Then on another station where the train stopped, there was a bit of a commotion outside the carriage, and I, kind of in curiosity, looked out, And to my horror, there was one of my cases on the platform. I thought, what? I jumped off the train and tried to explain what's going on. Somebody had taken it off, and there it was. I had persuaded them that it was my luggage and I wasn't getting off there, so it was put back on the train. Anyway, in Paris, it was interesting because I had 5 pieces of luggage to try and carry. That was fine if you had a luggage trolley, but in Paris, I had to go up an escalator from one platform to the main exit. I could carry 2 or 3 cases, but not 5 at once. So I took 2 cases up to the next level, left them on the platform, went back down, and a lady from the station very kindly helped me with the other 3 to get up to the next level to find my cases had disappeared off the platform. In inquiring, I found that they had been taken into an office, obviously a security risk, unattended baggage, which I had overlooked the fact that there were signs up saying not to leave unattended luggage. So I reclaimed my my luggage from there and continued. Then another problem was that when I was getting towards from Paris to cross over, I was informed that the channel was rough and the ferry wasn't going from Boulogne, it was going from Calais. So instead of destination Boulogne to Dover, I had to get a ferry, hovercraft in fact, and it was a bit rough and bouncing on the waves, from Calais to Dover. So I arrived in Dover and I phoned the neighbour to see, because I was completely different time scale for what I'd arranged with my parents. I had no idea what was going to happen. I phoned the neighbour and said, can you get a message to my parents that I'm leaving Dover on such a train and we'll be arriving in whatever station it was? Oh, he said, your parents left a little while ago in a white van. Oh, thank you. I got the train from Dover to London. I can't remember now which station it was. But with my 5 pieces of luggage, I managed to get a luggage trolley. And I thought, now what? I haven't a clue whether my parents have received a notice I'm coming into this station. I haven't a clue whether they've know what time or anything else. I loaded these 5 cases onto the luggage trolley and walked out one of the exits, and there was a white van in the car park. I walked up to it and there was my mum sitting in a white van in the car park. I thought, how on earth? I said, where's Dad? Oh, he's just gone to see where he can park. He didn't think your train was in yet, so he's gone to find somewhere he can park. I caught them within minutes, sitting in a white van in a car park in a London station. After being away from home 6.5 years, that was the first time I saw my mum. And that was a relief, I might tell you. So I hope that the Lord is faithful. And he does understand our ups and downs. It was a great relief that I saw my mum and I was able to get my lift home. I spent several months back at home, and then in connection with the WEC headquarters in Bulstrode in Giles Cross, had to negotiate. I had complete blank of what my future would be. I had no idea. I knew I wasn't going back to Uruguay, but I had no idea what the future would be. And I had to just trust the Lord would open up the way. But I'm not going to go into the detail about that just at the moment. I hope that I've not bored you with my journeys. That the point of it was that, as we started off saying, there's things happen in life, and not just on a physical journey, but on our spiritual journeys and in our daily lives. Things happen that sometimes they just don't make sense. We don't see a way out. We think, how on earth did I get to this? And how on earth am I going to get out of this? But as the brother from Cellar Church said, and I've used it myself, when in his message the other week, he said, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. I could not have written the script for my life story. I could not have worked out the details of how things would happen, and I couldn't understand them when they did happen. But looking back, as the psalmist said, God is still faithful. Even though I don't understand the things that are happening around me that I cannot put on, make head or tail of, God is still in control. I don't know what your circumstances are, what the future holds either for any of us. But if we believe what we've sung in those songs that we sang, all the way my Saviour leads me, is the one we're going to sing to close. Thank you. The Lord is faithful. As the psalmist said, I thought of this. I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will meditate on your works and consider all your mighty deeds, and that will give me the confidence that he who has helped me thus far will not fail me, however much longer I might have. I was just thinking this morning when I was trying to put a conclusion to this, 60 odd years that I've known the Lord and he's not let me down yet. However much longer I've got, I don't think he'll let me down then either. God bless you.